everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Glad to see everybody here and everybody on Zoom today. This is another program in our series, Saving Our Savannas, Stories of the Longleaf Pine. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas, the Director of Learning and Community Engagement. And on the side of the room, we have Victoria Bergstrom, who is helping to co-moderate. I'd like to take a moment to thank our Saving Our Savannas sponsors for supporting this season's programs, the Nature Conservancy as an advocate sponsor, the American Indian Center and Southern Conservation Partners as promotion partners, and Jackie and Rob Trickle, Chuck Rowe and Charlotte Jones Rowe, and the Triangle Land Conservancy as community sponsors. Their funding for this series is tremendously important and greatly valued. Nancy Strickland Chavis has had an 18-year museum career, which has been focused on museum education and administration. She has worked at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and the American Indian Cultural Center and Museum in Oklahoma City. Her current role is director and curator of the Museum of the Southeast American Indian in Pembroke, North Carolina. She is the first Lumbee graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she earned a bachelor's degree in museum studies. Nancy earned a master's degree in history from UNC Wilmington and is currently a doctoral student in the public history program at NC State University. Nancy's area of research focuses on Southeastern Native peoples and the American colonial experience. Nancy is a trustee for the North Carolina Humanities Council and serves as a board member for the Robeson County Arts Council and the Museum of the Cape Fear. And Nancy is a member of the Lumbee tribe. Her family resides in and around the Pembroke area. She was raised in Charlotte with very close ties to her family in Robeson County. So Nancy, it's my pleasure to bring you up here to the stage.
Thank you. This is my first time being here, and it is just breathtaking. It is stunning. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here with you all and to see some familiar Native faces in the audience. So I might refer to you all in my presentation or during the Q&A because I realized putting this presentation together just how much just connection that we have culturally that I think we take for granted. So I'm excited to explore this topic with you all. So longleaf pine as a source of food, medicine, and craft for tribal nations of the Southeast. I am Lumbee, so I'm specifically going to be speaking to that perspective, but I'm also going to talk about the Waccamaw Siouan and the Coharie in my presentation as well. So I wanted to start with this concept of bounded space. How many of you are familiar with the concept of bounded space, whether it's in architecture or landscape? Anyone? Okay, so it's this philosophical understanding that the spaces that we live in inform our identity and culture. There's this wonderful scholar, Miranda Belarde Lewis, and she, if you're familiar with Preston Singletary's work on PBS, there's a Craft in America series that's airing right now. He's a glass blower. He was trained by Dale Chihuly. This is a shameless build-up plug I'm doing here. I have an exhibit at the North Carolina Museum of Art that's on view right now called To Take Shape and Meaning. It's one of the largest contemporary Native art exhibits that's ever taken place in the country. Preston Singletary is in that show. But his work reflects his landscape, so he's one of many great examples to this point. Miranda helped put this exhibition together with Preston and the PBS show. I want to get to this point. I went down a rabbit hole there. This idea, she quotes Apache philosopher Viola Cordova. In Native American philosophy, bounded space is the natural environment one exists in, and the relationship has one with that space. Cordova believed this space affects everything about a person, their language, culture, spirituality, and their aesthetics, how they believe something should be, look, or the ideas of beauty. And that is certainly true for Native peoples and the environments that we live in. In eastern North Carolina, where Lumbee people live, Waccamaw Siouan, and Coharie folks live, come on in, we're just getting started. I was delayed because of weather. Um, we are surrounded by swamps. We are surrounded by, in our case, our Lumbee River. And I chose this image to kind of speak to this concept of bounded space, that you can see this is a home within our community that sits right on the edge of the river. And it's almost seems like it's just kind of tethering on the banks of the river here on this bluff by these cypress trees. And this is so familiar for even the folks from our community that are here, because that is how we exist within our landscape, and that's what informs our identity. Many of us say that there is a magnetism to our homelands. There's just a sense of place and belonging, and when you're away from that space, it certainly pulls and draws you back. I know Danielle and I are recently returning. Well, I've been back now for 7 years after being gone for 15 years, living away, and that you just feel this draw back to home, and it's powerful. And that goes for all of the tangible and intangible parts of our landscape that inform who we are. And that includes the flora and fauna, and for us, it certainly involves longleaf pine. So one of the first places that I wanted to start is, of course, longleaf pine exists throughout the southeast region of the United States. It has had a very storied past, and right now is endangered, but is coming back. But I wanted to explore how we engage with longleaf pine, and one of the most recognizable ways for early explorers that were coming through the region, and actually coming up through the Carolinas in the 1500s, especially among the Spanish. So Vasquez, de Soto, Pardo in the 1600s, is that we would take pine trees and sort of line them up. And there aren't any images of this, but line them up and then fold the tops of the trees over to create the roof of the dwellings, and then lash those together, similarly to how the thatching is done on tops of these dwellings. This is a DeBry image from North Carolina. And then the chinking, right, where you would take mud or wattle and daub style housing and then close up those gaps between those trees. And then we would take the longleaf pine and we would create palisades around our villages in the form of protection. So you can see this palisade here. Now, why do you think these trees would have been important to use for housing and even for palisades?
They last a long time.
They last a long time. Very good. They're resilient.
They're straight, tall.
They're straight and tall. The practicality that they're straight and tall. Absolutely. And you can kind of look across the savanna and identify the longleaf, and they're pretty uniform in size, and they pretty grow consistently in terms of size by year. So they're easy to harvest and they're easy to work with. And of course, that's even the practicality with telephone poles that we see today, right? Most of them were made out of longleaf pine and other pine trees. The palisades were important too, just as a point of protection. If you've been out to Town Creek Indian Mound, there's an existing palisade there that's around what part of the footprint of the village. And that just also not only provides protection, but it also kind of gives you an eye on who's coming in and who's coming out, right? And so just even in the initials, we're kind of building up into cultural meaning. Our houses, our existence, our dwellings being made from pine trees. I think some of my slides might have got out of order here. Let's see here. How can I do this and see the ordering? I'm sorry, you all. I don't know what happened there. Sometimes technology has a mind of its own. have never had this happen in a live presentation before, but you all are giving me good vibes. I'm not panicking too much here. And I am so sorry for the Zoom people too. I know you guys are there. Oh, there's the camera. When I go to, let's go there. Okay. We might have to jump around in topics here. I had it kind of lined up, but that's okay. That gives you, that reinforces that cultural meaning that we could just kind of go through all of the different layers of importance. When we think about traditional culture and use of pine trees, not only for, or longleaf pine for housing, but also for material in cultural objects. So here we have examples of pine needle baskets that are made by Miss Loretta Oxendine. And then another shameless plug, my husband is here and he's shown weaving a basket. And he did this really cool thing that I think is interesting. And this is just a complete anomaly here is he usually weaves baskets when we travel, or my daughter and granddaughter live in Oklahoma and we do these long haul drives. He'll start making a basket. And we were on our way through Knoxville driving, and he just took his phone and turned on his flashlight, and this basket that he had made on the trip, he put over the flashlight, and it illuminated it in this really beautiful way. I mean, it was just him kind of playing around with the basket. And it also projected throughout the car this beautiful, like, sort of starscape, if you will. It was almost like the night skies. It looked, and it sort of looked like the universe. And it was a little bit of an aha moment for us in that the spiral that creates, actually, here's a few examples of his baskets. So when you think about the bottom of the basket and how the spiral starts and it moves out, it does feel very much like the universe and this worldview. And we know that our early origins, our cosmology is tied to stargazing and this understanding of the cosmos and the world in which we live. And that just felt very poignant. So it's kind of had me really focusing more on the creation of the bottom of the baskets than the final shape itself. But of course, these baskets were used for utilitarian purposes and continued for a very long time. And it's interesting because, come on in, we're just getting started. Because the coil method is used to build the basket. So you can see that once you get the bottom going, then you start building up along the edge and just kind of coiling the methods and sewing the baskets together. This is a universal method of basketry throughout the world, but we were specifically using longleaf pine in the southeast region of the United States and of the state itself, and we were also using dwarf palmettos and other materials like that to weave baskets. It's been suggested that even our methods of basketry were taught and inspired African American basket makers, especially down in the Charleston region and other areas that informed just those methods of how to use the materials that were in the environment around them. Now, a little bit of where that slide that kind of snuck in there kind of affects some of these traditions is with the loss of longleaf pine. So we'll talk about that more here in just a second. But longleaf pine needle baskets sort of declined within our communities around 1920 or 1930, and that's when you almost see the complete annihilation of longleaf pine, especially in the eastern part of the state. And we'll talk about the agents that affected longleaf pine. It's just starting to make its way back. And Miss Loretta and her husband Herman are credited with really bringing it back in a powerful, meaning way among our communities right around, I would say, the early 1990s. And of course, these are very laborious baskets to make. It takes time to harvest the materials. It takes time to make the baskets. And so Miss Loretta was a teacher, and in her retirement is when she and her sister actually remembered making the baskets as young girls. And on a whim, they thought, we should make these again and share them. And it just took off like wildfire. But what was interesting among our community is that it was so familiar and so recognizable that people just were enamored with them and were buying the baskets first as a reintroduction. And then people wanted to learn how to make them. And that was very, very important, where that interest was there for people's desires to learn how to make them. So Miss Loretta was one of the first in our community to start teaching workshops about weaving pine needle baskets again. And that's what brought it back fully and wholly. It's interesting among our community, if you come to our powwows or any of our social gatherings, you'll see native dancers. In fact, I'm wearing one right now that have like translated this affinity for the pine needle weaving and the longleaf pine itself as part of the environment. Think about that bounded space, right? The importance of our cultural environments to inform identity. Wearing it as jewelry, wearing it as part of their regalia. I've even seen someone have a pine needle crown, which was really impressive. And so it has just kind of brought that meaningful cultural tradition back to us through her interest of reconnecting. Harlan actually learned to weave from one of his fraternity brothers in a workshop. And he said that, and this was really more of like a bonding thing among the guys. It wasn't like, you will be restoring longleaf pine needle baskets kind of thing. It was just a time for the guys to get together and bond. And he said once that bottom section, which also made this image so relevant, once he kind of started on his first bottom section and got the coiling going, it was like magic. He said it just spoke to him. It resonated with him. It was so powerful. And he really said it felt like blood memory. It felt like there was something in him where his hand started doing that movement of sewing and coiling the pine needles together that it had been done before. This was the second basket he ever made. The first one was really small. This is the third, where he started experimenting with shape. And this is the fourth one where he's experiencing with shape and size, just to see what the pine needles will do. And the fifth one is actually in our museum in an exhibit now, and it is just absolutely stunning. And it's remarkable that someone could take off with an art form that they've never really done before, and it feels so natural to them. And that really speaks volumes. And we find that happening a lot as we go through cultural reclamation and experimenting and experiencing our traditions that have been lost to us for a while. And it just kind of naturally comes right back in many instances. Okay, let's see the organization of these slides. Yes, okay, it worked out. So what we want to do at the museum to help foster that, especially with Longleaf, is we have this wonderful relationship with the Nature Conservancy. I know many of you folks are members of the Nature Conservancy or are familiar with their work. They're absolutely remarkable. And they have given us access in an effort to even build a stronger relationship with our community to reestablish longleaf pine within our communities. They've given us access to Callaway Forest down in Rayford. How many of you know where Callaway Forest is? Okay, a couple of you. It's not too far from here, about an hour. And it is a nature preserve that backs up to Fort Liberty. Gosh, I I think there's something like 100,000 acres, and it is an absurd amount of land. But they do hunting, horseback riding. Of course, they're preserving various kinds of plants. There are even several carnivorous plants that are there, and I think there's traces of Venus flytraps out there. But what we've done is we work with a group of girls that's at a school that's next door to the university called Communities in Schools. And we get to work with a group of eighth grade girls. We get a different cohort every semester. And we get to go out and teach them how to gather materials to create longleaf pine needles to make baskets. So this is the first step in learning about how to weave, is how to gather your materials. Where do you go? Where do you find them? Of course, the loss of longleaf pine and accessibility are two of our big challenges of how to acquire the pine needles. And so by the Nature Conservancy maintaining Callaway Forest and having these old savannas of longleaf pine that they nurture. Of course, they're doing controlled burns. We're able to take these girls out and let them gather pine needles to learn how to weave baskets. In fact, one of the girls made this necklace for me out of one of the classes. This is really exciting because you can see how excited that they are about this process, about being out in nature, about connecting with ancestral knowledge, about being empowered through their identity. It is really strong. And this girl, gosh, this has been about a year and a half ago. I can't remember her name, but she was just so into it, and they're really into who could gather the perfect pine needles, which ones would be best for the baskets. And of course, we had folks out there that were helping them. And we were also looking at other medicinal plants that were on the landscape. And so she got to try sassafras. So she's got sassafras leaves in her mouth, and then she's holding pine needles. And for me, I feel like my work is done in the world. If I can walk away and she's happy about that, so am I. She and the other young lady got a little bit of a competition, which was really fun. Um, the photograph to your left and the middle photograph are ladies from the Waccamaw Siouan community, and they are also introducing the tradition of longleaf pine needle baskets back in their community. So this was also at Callaway Forest, where we went out with them and folks from the Nature Conservancy to gather pine needles, and they were interested in sort of like, I think this basket is one that Harlan did with green pine needles, and then seeing how it would turn brown or age once the basket was complete. So there's a couple of different methods. So they were pulling green pine needles, but kind of doing it at the where it attaches to the limb without damaging the tree or hurting the growth of new pine needles. So this revitalization is really exciting, what's happening with us through our art forms. And this has also given, we always think about longleaf pine in terms of industry, especially the turpentine industry, the lumber industry, logging. But this reapplies that cultural meaning of why it's so important to have longleaf pine back within our communities. And of course, traditionally, and I don't want to overstate this, I know it's in the title, but medicine and food, kind of the two main ways that folks can consume kind of a longleaf pine is through pine needle tea. How many of you all have had pine needle tea before? One person, two, three, just a few of you. It's pretty bitter. It's not a very fun tea. You're in it for the vitamins, but you can make a tea out of it. It is high in vitamin C and other nutrients, and it fights off infections. So in this respect, we would have used pine needle tea more in the form of medicine to fight off colds, respiratory issues. Um, um, it's also good for skin. It helps with fatigue. So there's different purposes of it. Now, some people do drink just for ongoing health benefits, pine needle tea, and also sassafras tea is still really big among our community. I can remember going to my aunt's house from Charlotte to Robson County, and it was just like, it was very frequent. It was about once or twice a month. And in the summers, in June, I can remember, my mom basically on two wheels pushing me out of the car and saying, "I'll see you in August," to spend the summers down there. But my aunt always had a huge, like, I think it was like an old giant pickle jar, but with sassafras tea in there. And she would sweeten hers with sugar, but that was like the tea of the house, that we would drink sassafras tea. There's a recipe down here for how to make it. It's very simple. You just gather green pine needles. You can break them up, pour boiling water over them, and just let them steep for about 15 minutes. And then you can add sweetener if you like. You can also eat the seeds, both raw and roasted, and they're great in salads and other ways like that. They're also very good and very high in vitamin C as well. Now, these are traditional medicines that aren't, I don't want to do a single brushstroke. For some, people are still engaging with both eating the seeds and also making pine needle tea, but not as much. But I can see that also making a comeback with us. Now, one very important way that Longleaf informs our culture and identity is through our Lumbee dress and our pinecone patchwork quilt. I'm polling the audience again. How many of you have seen this quilt in person or at our museum, or have seen a Lumbee dress? Okay. The quilt itself, this photo doesn't do it justice, but each of these patches represents the bottom of a longleaf pine cone. Of course, we are surrounded, our environment is surrounded by longleaf. And so Maggie Lowry created this quilt for her husband. So Maggie Lowry Locklear, I'm sorry, created this quilt for her husband. We have it in our museum. It goes on, this quilt has a great story, but it goes on in the 80s while it's in the museum to inspire a gentleman named Hayes Allen Locklear. And he wanted to create a dress for Lumbee women that could be worn at powwows, that could be worn at social events, that represented who we are and our identity. He was inspired by the quilt, but more so the meaning of the quilt, right? So as a Native person, when we are at powwows or social gatherings or intertribal events where there's other Native people who might also be wearing clothing that represents their identity, he wanted something that spoke strongly about who and where we come from. And what better representation to do that than through the longleaf pine? There's two kind of dueling identities among Lumbee people that I think that there should be one unified banner. One is people of the pine, and the other is people of the dark water. Those are both of our spaces and places that we live in. But this representation definitely speaks to the importance of longleaf pine to us, and the nostalgia and the memory and the genetic memory that lives among us of the importance of longleaf pine. And you can see on her chest is the pinecone patchwork. So quite literally, Hayes Allen took one of these patches and then kind of came up with this idea about how it could be worn on a regalia. So she has it on her apron. She also has it on her shawl, and then she has it on the front of her dress. Now the patches, the dress designs themselves and the composition of the patches is unique to the wearer. And there's many makers among our community that create these dresses, and they're made all the time for women to wear. So this is a huge source of pride for us, which is really, really exciting that we have this. So if you'll notice, we're kind of weaving between the historic and contemporary and uses among many different ways. And the other way that both traditional and contemporary, which I'm really proud to say, is through our canoe traditions. Many of the canoes that are recently being found, we have one in our museum that was found back in 1980 in the Lumbee River, also called the Lumber River in Lumberton. It was near the 5th Street Bridge. It's 1,100 years old. It's made out of longleaf pine. There was a canoe that we worked with the Waccamaw Siouan community and the the state of North Carolina and underwater archaeology to preserve, found in Lake Waccamaw was also made of longleaf pine. Last year, another canoe out of Lake Waccamaw came up. This is a photograph of the North Carolina Indian Heritage Commission and the State Office of Archaeology removing that canoe from the water for preservation and study. This was also a longleaf pine. So this prevailing understanding that Native peoples are using longleaf pine as the preferred wood for canoe making is really exciting, and it's an area that we're exploring more. We have a program right now called Life by the River that we're working on at the museum, and one of the concepts or one of the elements of that program was to create a dugout canoe. And so we worked with the Nature Conservancy, actually went to Callaway Forest and fell a longleaf pine and built a dugout canoe at our cultural center site. And that was about, just like we're talking about the basket weaving, about the dresses, about how we use the make the tea for medicine. This was a way of engaging the community back with the technology and the methodology of creating a canoe and just seeing if it worked. There was no grandiose idea about an outcome of like, we're going to have this stellar canoe that we're going to travel around in. Our biggest concern was, is it going to float? And are we doing everything that it's going to float? And of course, using the traditional method of creating a series of fires inside of the canoe, and then, or the wood itself, removing that material, and then just kind of keep working away with it. Now, there were some chainsaws that were involved. There was a lumber mill that helped us plane it in half, which was really important. And then we had some big trucks that helped transport it. So we didn't quite get very traditional in that respect, but we're sure if our ancestors would have had those tools, they would have used them at their disposal as well. So we felt good about it, being authentic to the process. But it's really rewarding to see, and I didn't want to take up our time with a video to share about that, but to see the community engaging in that process and the sense of pride that people have that they helped build the canoe, and the sense of pride that we had that it did float and people got in it and were able to travel around the lake that's at our cultural center was really, really powerful. Let's see. Now I want to talk real quickly. This is an area that's very important to me, or a bird rather that's very important to me. And I think it's a cautionary tale. And I know all of you are very interested in the sacredness of our environments, and what it all means to us and our well-being and who we are as stewards of our landscapes and our environments. But the Carolina parakeet is, how many of you are familiar with the Carolina parakeet? So oh, this is, we are. How many of you love the Carolina parakeet? There we go. Okay. Of course, the Carolina parakeet was a bird that was indigenous to the southeast region of the United States. And it was one of our most beloved birds. We kept these as pets. So if you read John Lawson's writing, there's a lady that was Waccamaw, and she has a Carolina parakeet as a pet with a little ring around its ankle and some sort of little string kind of holding it. And but we also use them in our feather work. So for feather mantles, feather capes, of course, they have these beautiful green and yellow feathers that we would use. And Carolina parakeets, along with our water birds, were big indicators for us, along with other animals as well, as indicators of how well our environment is doing. And we know that birds are usually the first indicators if there's any trouble within an ecosystem. As long as the birds are healthy, the ecosystem is healthy, right? So the first threat to our ecosystem, in a way that still the legacy is felt today, was through colonization. And what the Carolina parakeet did was, their environment was they enjoyed roosting in longleaf pine. They enjoyed feasting on the seeds. It was their preferred place to roost. And they were also vocable. How many of you knew that Carolina parakeets could talk? They were vocable. Now here's the kicker. When the Spanish first came here, they realized that the Carolina parakeet spoke many different native languages. So one could imagine the high, high tops of these tall longleaf pines are all of these beautiful, colorful birds, almost looking like ornaments in a Christmas tree in a way, right? And then you're in a new world. You're trying to make contact with native peoples. Some are very happy you're here, some not so much, as the Spanish. And so as night falls and these birds are in the trees, they're speaking native language. So you don't know if it's a real person or the Carolina parakeet that's up in the tree rather. So they start shooting them. And that's kind of the first impact that the Carolina parakeet has felt. Then the Carolina parakeets pick up Spanish, and they're blending Spanish with native language. And it's interesting to go back in these old Spanish archives and see how the Carolina parakeet is written about in terms of language. But they were regarded as being beautiful. They would blanket the sky, black out the sun, and this rainbow of color. But then as more settling happened in the Carolinas, especially after 1750, and there's more farming that's happening, the longleaf pine was removed. Also, as you have more ships that are coming in and out of the New World, a lot of those were used, the longleaf pine was used for naval stores and the turpentine industry, both for the wood and the tar and the pitch that comes from longleaf pine, which further reduced the roosting places for the Carolina parakeet and their habitat. And then, of course, next we know that farming, agriculture comes into our region, which further clears out more longleaf pine to make way for clear farmland. So then the birds don't have a place to roost, they don't have a place to eat, so they start eating the crops. So you see this constant sort of taking out the Carolina parakeet, so farmers start shooting them. So today, those are by and large the reasons that the Carolina parakeet is extinct. And it really has to do with they were indigenous to their homelands, they were closely tied to the longleaf pine, and by virtue of the longleaf pine leaving, it changed their lifeways and their habitats and how they fed themselves, and then they were in the way and they were killed. They were annihilated. So I think the Carolina parakeet is a cautionary tale. I make an interesting metaphor in different kinds of presentations, history presentations, that the Carolina parakeet is a metaphor for native peoples. We kind of follow that same trajectory. There was a use for us, there was a habitat, there was a place, and as the land became smaller and smaller, there was less of a space for us and a use for us, and then there was a push also for us to disappear. And so this was one of our most beloved birds, and here we are as native people still hanging on, and that Carolina parakeet is gone. So I think it's an interesting parallel. So I mentioned the turpentine industry. A lot of you are probably familiar with the turpentine industry, and I do want to say that lots and lots and lots and lots, almost every native man, just about, I would say 90% between Waccamaw Siouan, Lumbee, and Coharie in eastern North Carolina and other tribes along the eastern part of the state engaged in the turpentine industry. We were doing turpentine starting around 1790s. Turpentine informed several of our huge migrations out of our communities, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where a lot of us went down to Georgia, the panhandle of Florida, and parts of Alabama. In fact, my grandmother was born in Dothan, Alabama, while her family was down doing turpentine. After her birth, she told my great-grandfather if he didn't get her back to Robeson County, she was going to walk back. And she started walking, and he loaded up the wagon, and they came back. But it was a really tough industry, and it was a tough place to raise families in turpentine camps. But the industry itself, through naval stores, the creation of tar, pitch, turpentine, the lumber that was needed for the booming growth of the southeast region, just really dealt that final blow for almost wiping out all of the longleaf pine that was in the southeast region of the United States. And of course, just completely threatened the species overall. And now there's efforts to try to restore and bring it back, of course, through places like the Nature Conservancy. They just did a big planting with our community at our cultural center in Pembroke. Excuse me. I think they planted over 100 longleaf pine trees with the hope that within 50 to 100 years, it will fully restore a big part of the longleaf pine that was gone. And they're also doing a lot of, I think I do want to go back to the controlled burn slide. They're working with landowners to reintroduce the idea of widespread controlled burn. And for a lot of places in our tribal communities, farming is still very important. So if you have big tracts of land, you're using it and farming it. If you have big tracts of land, probably with loblolly pine on it, you're harvesting it to sell. So, but there are still people in places that have land that has longleaf pine. And so what the Nature Conservancy is doing is bringing back controlled burns because, of course, longleaf pine is dependent on fire. It's one of the few species that has to have fire to thrive. And we know the benefit of burning, and that's the other part that we're working on with communities, is to talk about traditionally Native peoples would have actually used a lot of controlled burns for taking down the underbrush that would have been within forested areas, as pest management to get rid of ticks and fleas and red bugs. Control burns support other plant life, especially closer to the coastal plain. And then maintaining clear savannas provide grazing lands for animals, and in turn afforded us a food source in our communities where you didn't have to go too far away from home for food sources. One interesting thing that I'll put in here real quickly about controlled burns and hunting is one of our practices was to take an area where there might be several deer dens or rabbits or different types of game, and to build a circular fire around this area and leave just kind of a narrow opening. And then what you're going to do is light that fire, and then the animals are going to run out that opening. And then you would have hunters that are just outside of that are going to take that game that's coming out. Once enough game has been harvested, people are going to go around, they're going to put out that fire, and the animals are going to go back to their habitat. It sounds very Disney, but it is a true method. It's almost like the buffalo jumps that are out west. Buffaloes would jump off cliffs. You have people at the bottom of the cliff that would harvest the meat, or fish kills that we did. Take black walnut hulls, put them in a sachet, submerge them in the water. It removes the oxygen. It has a toxin that removes the oxygen from the water. The fish float to the top, and you net them out. You take that sachet out, the currents of the water clear out that toxin, and the remaining fish swim on. This keen sense of environmental knowledge, this keen sense of bounded space was so important to us. And the longleaf pine is just one of those essential beings that we had, that we treasured, that we valued, that we maintained, that we were stewards of and took care of. And that is coming back to us full and wholly again. And it's really an exciting time. I think I have a few minutes left for questions. Whoops, let me go back. Does anyone have any questions about any of the topics that I've shared, or anything you want to share, or comments? Yes, ma'am.
I was more interested in the construction of the quilt.
Yes.
As you picked bottom pine cones.
Mm-hmm.
Did she paint, or was it needlework, or?
So she was inspired by the design itself. So she took little scraps, so it's quilting, little scraps of fabric, and then created concentric circles that emulated the design on a longleaf pine. Yeah, so yeah, the pine cone itself wasn't involved in the quilt, but it replicates that. Yes, very good. Yes, and then I'll get to you.
Is there any significance to the colors in the dress that you showed us?
It's up to the individual wearer, whatever she maybe likes, or it might represent. Of course, we're Southerners. I always preface that. As Lumbee people, as Native peoples in the Southeast, we are uniquely Southern. We also love beauty pageants as Southerners. So in our Miss Lumbee pageants and other, in the Miss Lumbee pageant, sometimes they will have a platform in if they were to win, what they would represent and talk about. So sometimes the colors match with that platform. Sometimes it could represent a girl's youth or for kind of older women that are wearing the dress, kind of different times in their life. So each one is unique to the wearer herself. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, at the beginning, you mentioned there's a display at one of the local museums with the Native American art. Which museum was it?
North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh. Yes. It's called To Take Shape and Meaning. Shameless plug. It will be up through July 28th. Yes. Yes.
So you were talking about most of the men being working in turpentine industry, working for the man, right? So did the turpentine have any use to the Native Americans before it became a source of
I
employment?
don't know if we were, I think of like the turpentine process as like distilling in a way. And so I know that after after the introduction of the industry, people would drink turpentine as medicine. Sometimes they would use it to wash their hair with, or, turpentine was like a cure-all for everything, I think, back in the day. But do you know, Danny, of it being used before? I think that was just a very specific process that came to us. But there weren't a lot of jobs that we could do or that we were allowed to do during that time. And so for us engaging in the turpentine industry, some of us would be woodsmen who are going out to identify trees, like Preston Locklear was an important member of our community. And then the ones who were actually tapping the trees for turpentine, and then the ones that would come back afterwards and cut the trees down for the lumber part of it. Because of different reasons of segregation and things like that, there weren't many industries we could work in, but we could work in the turpentine industry and earn cash, which was a big deal. It did require being away from family a lot of the time, but yes. Yes, ma'am.
Question from Zoom.
Yes.
Does Ms. Loretta still teach pine needle baskets?
I'm not sure if she's still teaching. I think she's still making. She and her husband are still making pine needle baskets, but I'm not sure if they're still teaching. That's a good question. We need to find that out.
And I'll add a note that we're hoping to have Carolina Chavis teach basket weave or pine needle weaving. It'll probably be this fall, so stay tuned.
Perfect. He's a great teacher. He's really good. Yes. Anyone else? Does anyone from the community? Oh, did I move? Yes. Yes.
So in the book, Herbal Remedies of the Lumbee Indians, the authors mention using longleaf pine for colds, arthritis, kidneys, respiratory problems, etc. Is there a source for the formularies of these remedies?
That is a great question. When you're saying a source, like a medical source, or like a meaning?
I'm not sure.
How to-
Maybe, but you gave kind of a formulary for pine needle tea.
Yes. Okay. Like a recipe or how it's used kind of thing. Yes. And I think in terms of, who knows how ancient that knowledge is. And so I think it's just been passed along from generation to the next to say this works for these types of things, and here's how to prepare it. Yeah. Did anyone from the Native community want to say anything that I might have missed, or that you're just like, oh, we really need to share this part? I'm looking at Ryan. Ryan's one of our cultural keepers here, Ryan Dial.
I think you got it all.
Okay, very good. All right. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
So how much pine needles would you put for a cup of tea?
I've seen done, I've only had it prepared for me, so I've never prepared it, but I would say about 4 or 5 pine needles, and you kind of break them up into quarters, and that will give you a nice palatable tea. If you do anything more than that, it's going to be really, really bitter. So it's a really light tea in that way. Yes.
I have one comment from my childhood. There used to be a pharmaceutical, well, I guess it was an OTC, called turpentine and codeine. Does anybody else, I'm sure there's some other people of my generation. Does anyone remember that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Serious narcotic.
Well,
Yeah.
that's why you can't buy it.
Yeah.
That's right. I did.
In our collection, when I started at the museum, we had about 4 jars of turpentine that almost had evaporated, but one said medicine, one said for cleaning, one said, oh gosh, I can't remember the other two, but there were 4 jars and they had little pieces of tape where someone had written them on there, but they all looked the same. And I thought, well, how do you tell that, like, if it's all turpentine, does that mean someone's just stuck a dirty rag in the one and someone stuck a spoon in the other one, or what distinguished it? But yeah, it was used pretty widely and just had an indelible result in longleaf pine. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are today. I've heard some recent numbers, but it was almost completely wiped out. So I think it's interesting for landowners to consider replanting and sort of that long view, especially if they have generational land that they anticipate willing to someone that will look after it. And, you know, I think it needs at least 50 to 100 years to really take off. But it's so interesting to be here. And then I'll wrap up to know that we see this in many, many ways in our everyday life, but here's one example of something that's endangered and that where we could have a powerful role in saving it. So thank you all so much. I appreciate you. Thank you for your patience. Please come see us at the museum down in Pembroke. We'd love to have you.
Nancy, thank you so much. It's really an honor and privilege for the garden to have you here, especially after such a busy spring that you've had. And yeah, I encourage everybody to go to the NC Museum of Art. Not a shameless plug, just a plug. So please go see that exhibit. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to our Zoom audience for being with us. And we hope to see you for more Saving Our Savannas programs upcoming into the next month. Have a great day.